My name is Marisa Caldwell, and my wedding at Lake Union should have felt like the start of something steady. Yet the moment I stepped into the reception and saw my parents seated beside the service doors where trays kept slamming through, the entire room tilted into something I couldn't ignore. My dad tried to lift the moment with a quiet comment about how he liked hearing the water outside. But the only sound reaching him was the clatter of metal racks, brushing his chair each time staff rushed past. My mom kept smoothing the edge of the tablecloth as if the fabric could hide how deliberately they had been placed where no one else would have to look at them. I leaned closer and asked why their table had only 4 chairs when every other family section held 8. And a passing server lowered her voice just enough to tell me the layout had been changed that morning under Diana Stratford's instructions. I crossed the room to Diana, who was smiling at a cluster of donors near the floral arch. And she lifted her glass with a gracious expression before explaining that some of our guests came from circles where noticeable differences can disrupt the atmosphere. Jacob stood 3 yards away, pretending not to listen. And when I stepped beside him, expecting even a small objection, he reminded me this was our day, and we should let unnecessary tension go. The draft from the service door hit the back of my mother's neck again, and the way she tucked her hair forward told me she had felt it more than once. So I moved to the entrance where the seating mirror displayed every name in careful rings of priority. With my family pushed into the lone dim corner by the utility hallway, the reflection of the chandeliers pooled around the premium tables like a spotlight on everyone but them, and the contrast was sharp enough to cut through whatever patience I thought I still had. That was the moment I understood the placement wasn't oversight or logistics. It was intention, and the message behind it hardened into the decision that carried me toward the DJ booth. I found Jacob near the terrace where the lake lights stretched across the water. And before I reached him, he reminded me that weddings attract scrutiny, and we should avoid creating a tone people remember for the wrong reasons. Which landed flat because my parents shivering by the service door was already the tone I couldn't unsee. He looked past me toward the premium tables, as if the room's order was something fragile that couldn't bear confrontation. And the way his jaw tightened when I asked how long he had known about the seating told me he wasn't wrestling with truth but with inconvenience. Whatever restraint I had left thinned enough for me to turn toward the DJ booth because silence had already chosen its side. I stepped beside the booth where the music softened into the background. And when the DJ handed me the microphone, the room shifted the way water stills before a wake hits. So I let my voice carry across the tables and began by thanking everyone for being part of a day built on effort, far beyond what could be seen from the head table. I told them my parents were tucked near the service door, not because they preferred quiet corners, but because humility often gets mistaken for something disposable. And when a few guests turned toward that dim section, I added that my father once spent a winter night repairing a ruptured heater line for a stranger who couldn't afford service and never charged $1 for it. The applause began uncertainly until my mother pressed her hand to her chest with the kind of stunned gratitude that doesn't need amplification. And the uneasy silence fractured into agreement that generosity deserved center light. I walked to the nearest middle table where Jacob's colleagues sat in a tight circle, and I asked whether they might switch seats for the evening so the people who had built my foundation could actually see the room they helped pay for. And Caleb rose first with a simple, "of course," as he gathered his jacket. The others followed without hesitation, clearing their plates with an efficiency that felt like correction rather than sacrifice. And the servers moved quickly to reset the linens, as if the room had simply misunderstood itself and was now making amends. My parents tried to protest with quiet gestures that they didn't want to disrupt anything, but their voices slipped under the growing wave of approval sweeping the center tables. When they finally sat where the chandeliers reached them and the lake shimmered behind the glass, the energy in the room rebalanced so cleanly that even Jacob couldn't hide the flicker of discomfort crossing his face. Because the hierarchy his family built had shifted without asking their permission. Diana stepped toward the DJ booth as if the microphone were already promised to her. And before anyone could redirect the program, she launched into a tribute about families who share the same expectations of excellence, lingering on each syllable as though she were curating the room's worthiness. She lifted her glass toward the head tables and eased into a line about how marriage demands alignment between households that understand reputation, then let her gaze drift to where my parents sat beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers that finally reached them. The pause that followed tightened when she added that some backgrounds require more adjustment than others, a sentence wrapped in applause that never quite formed. I felt the attention in the room compress as guests shifted in their chairs, and my mom's shoulders dipped a fraction when the words landed clearly enough that no one bothered pretending they meant something else. Jacob stood near the cake display, and the stillness in his posture told me he had heard every syllable, yet wouldn't disrupt the order his family valued more than fairness. Even the servers slowed as they passed the center aisle. Their trays balanced mid-air while they tried to understand whether the evening's tone had just changed for good. The silence fractured when Richard Barlow spoke from his table near the glass wall overlooking Lake Union. His voice steady, as he noted that people who come from humble beginnings tend to understand value in ways privilege never teaches. A few guests turned toward him with the kind of alertness that follows a boundary being drawn, and the ripples of attention spread through the center tables until even Diana's expression faltered around the edges. My dad offered a small nod toward Richard, the kind of gesture built from gratitude rather than performance, and the authenticity of it traveled farther across the room than the microphone ever had. Diana attempted a polished smile that didn't quite settle, but the room had already realigned around the contrast between her curated image and the truth she had exposed. Jacob glanced toward his parents as if weighing the cost of intervention, yet he held his place without stepping forward. And that stillness anchored the realization that the divide wasn't temporary but structural. When the DJ resumed the music with a softened transition, the shift in energy was unmistakable because respect had found its center, and the hierarchy Diana constructed wavered under the weight of its own intention. Back at the Edgewater with the city lights breaking across the water, Jacob shut the door behind us with a tense breath and told me I had turned our reception into something people won't forget for the wrong reasons. But the way he avoided my eyes made the room feel smaller than the hallway we had just walked through. I asked how it felt to watch my parents be diminished without stepping toward them, and he only tightened his tie as if control over fabric could compensate for the control he had surrendered over his own integrity. The distance between us settled into something sharper when he added that families endure awkward moments all the time, and that I had amplified something harmless into a spectacle. A line that landed too softly for what it tried to excuse. I told him there was nothing harmless about watching my mother brace against a draft, or my father pretending not to hear the service door slam. And the way he inhaled at the mention of those details revealed he had replayed them. Just not with the same weight. He kept pacing near the window as if movement might soften the truth, then insisted that navigating his mother's temperament was easier when things stayed quiet because temporary discomfort is better than permanent conflict. The justification thinned when my phone buzzed on the nightstand and his father's name flashed on Jacob's screen before he grabbed it with a speed that erased any illusion of calm. He listened long enough for the silence in the room to rearrange itself, and then he lowered the phone just enough for me to hear him ask how an investor could walk away over a misunderstanding that wasn't even ours. A line that froze midair when his father's voice carried through with the urgency of someone watching a foundation give way. He ended the call with a look that hovered between disbelief and fear, then told me Richard Barlow had walked out of the reception and notified the board he was withdrawing from the upcoming project until they completed an internal review of leadership conduct. The weight of those words tightened across his shoulders as he mentioned deadlines, contracts, and the ripple effect of a paused investment, each detail stitching itself into the reality he was trying to outrun. When he turned toward me with the accusation that my public performance had jeopardized his family's stability, the desperation beneath the words sharpened into something that mistook accountability for betrayal. I told him nothing about honoring my parents created the cracks he now feared, and the way he looked at the floor instead of at me confirmed that he knew which words at the wedding had carried farther than mine ever could. I packed my overnight bag with the steady rhythm of someone who had run out of space to negotiate dignity, and when I walked past him toward the hallway, he let the moment pass without reaching for it. leaving the sound of the door closing to mark the point where our marriage began to fracture with the same precision as the seating chart that started it. By the time I reached my parents' place in Linwood the next morning, my mom had laid out leftover flowers across the kitchen counter, and the quiet in the room tightened when her phone buzzed with a clip of Diana's speech, already circulating across Seattle forums, under a caption that asked how elitism still thrived in spaces pretending to champion community. My dad turned the screen toward me long enough for me to see the moment Diana emphasized backgrounds that require adjustment. And I recognized the ripple of discomfort in the comments from employees who had worked under the Stratfords. The momentum felt less like gossip and more like people releasing something they had held for too long. Caleb texted asking if he could stop by, and when he stepped into my parents' living room, he admitted the clip was his because someone needed context for what that room witnessed. And he mentioned years of quiet inequity at the Stratford company that made the moment resonate beyond a wedding. He explained how the video landed on Seattle tech subgroups within an hour, and how developers and project leads had begun adding their own accounts of leadership, favoring certain names and backgrounds, creating a thread longer than anything he had expected. My mother tried to reassure him that accountability wasn't cruelty, but his voice caught slightly when he said the culture there had been eroding long before my wedding exposed the seam. The tide grew heavier when Diana called and opened with, "You understand the damage this is causing," layering urgency over entitlement while insisting I help her reframe the narrative before more partners reconsidered their ties. I listened long enough to hear her insist that the video misrepresented a moment meant to uplift. And the phrasing struck me because its polish contrasted with the bluntness she'd used the night before. When I told her I couldn't erase what people had already heard, she went silent in a way that revealed she hadn't anticipated anything but compliance. Later that afternoon, Jacob arrived with tension woven into every step, and he insisted that a single post from me, clarifying that Diana's comments were taken out of context, could stop the momentum before it reached the next board review. I asked what context he thought could soften a line that diminished my family in front of 200 guests, and he rubbed his palms together as if friction could conjure an answer he didn't have. The moment he insisted that our marriage can survive this if you help us manage the fallout, I realized we weren't negotiating truth but his fear of losing the stability his family had built on an image already collapsing. The notifications piling on my phone weren't noise but evidence of a shift, with local reporters requesting background and former employees submitting detailed accounts to internal hotlines now reopened under board supervision. Jacob stood in my parents' doorway, searching for a version of me who would protect his family at the cost of mine. But the distance between us had widened with every clipped apology and every attempt to downplay what happened. When he finally whispered that my refusal would burn everything down, the words carried less warning than recognition. Because the flames he feared had been sparked by the truth, his family tried to hide in the corner of a wedding hall. When I opened my laptop that evening, the cursor blinking against the blank post felt steadier than anything in the past 48 hours, and I wrote plainly that my parents had been placed near the service doors at my own wedding, and that a speech about reputation and background had followed in full view of 200 people. I explained that respect doesn't hinge on income or circles of influence, and that defending the people who raised me wasn't something I viewed as optional. And the words settled with a clarity that didn't require embellishment. I posted it without naming a single Stratford, knowing the details were strong enough to stand without direction. By morning, my phone lit up with alerts from local journalists, connecting my post to the clip already circulating. And the headlines sharpened when Richard Barlow released a statement announcing his company wouldn't continue negotiations with any organization unable to demonstrate equitable leadership. The decision triggered a cascade across Seattle's business networks as 2 additional partners paused their contracts pending internal review. And the shift pressed into places the Stratfords had never expected to defend. The board overseeing Diana's arts fund followed with notice that she would step back during their independent assessment, a message delivered with the same formal tone she once reserved for others. Jacob showed up at my parents' driveway that afternoon, with exhaustion hanging on him. And he told me there was still a chance to salvage everything if I removed the post before the next round of investor meetings. I asked him what part of the truth he needed erased to feel whole again, and he rubbed at his temples before insisting that we can rebuild this if you help us calm the noise. The moment felt thin and breakable when he added that our marriage deserved protection. But the weight of his silence at the wedding still lived in the gap between us. I told him the fracture didn't come from the post, but from the moment he watched my parents shrink in their seats without stepping toward them, and his shoulders dipped with the understanding he'd tried to outrun since the reception. He looked at the doorway behind me, as if the life we planned was still sitting somewhere inside that house. Yet neither of us reached for it, and the stillness between us settled into our final answer. When he walked away without turning back, the quiet that followed felt less like loss and more like the clearing that comes after a storm has finished choosing its direction. Later that evening, my dad opened an email from Richard asking when he could bring by an old marine pump for restoration, and the pride, softening his face, rooted the entire week in something sturdier than regret. I didn't undo the Stratford legacy or topple their foundation. I only moved a table back to where dignity belonged, and everything that collapsed afterward was built on choices they made long before I walked toward that microphone. Thank you for spending this time with me and walking through a story that reshaped how I choose peace, dignity, and the people who stand beside me. If this moment resonated with you in any way, I'd love to have you here. Feel free to subscribe and stay connected.